Sometimes a wrestling booker will make a decision that's so poorly judged, you have to take a step back and wonder what caused them to ever think it would be a good idea in the first place. Sure, if you don't swing for the fences, then you'll never get anything interesting. However, sometimes these attempts can fall flat on their face. But what are the most egregious examples of this in wrestling history? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into What Were They Thinking? Wrestling's Worst Booking Decisions. And if we have to start somewhere, we can't think of anywhere better than the time when, despite having the most over babyface star on the roster since the early days of John Cena, WWE decided to say no to the Yes movement and instead go with Batista winning the Royal Rumble. That's right, back in 2014, there was no one hotter in the industry than Daniel Bryan. Why was this? Well, aside from being arguably the greatest wrestler alive, he was also likable on such a human level that fans quickly adopted him as their guy, even if Vince McMahon was hesitant to do the same himself. And this would lead to a situation where, over the latter half of 2013, a full-blown war would break out between the company and its audience, with shows regularly being hijacked by people who wanted nothing more than to see the American Dragon in the main event scene. Unfortunately though, no matter how loud they got, the boss still had his own ideas about what a star should be, and to him, this meant being 6'4", 260 pounds, and shredded with muscle. So given the fact that Bryan didn't really fit in with this image, it meant that McMahon would see him as little more than a B-plus player when compared to the other stars he had in his arsenal. And as it happened, one of his biggest stars from a prior era, Dave Batista, was looking to make a comeback at this point. So upon finding this out, the boss would make plans for him to return at the 2014 Royal Rumble and then go on to face Randy Orton at WrestleMania 30. Except this wasn't the story fans wanted. No, they were still insistent that Bryan was their guy, and so if anyone deserved to win the Rumble, it was him. And with this powder keg of emotion swirling around the lead up to the event itself in January then, all it would take would be one bad decision to light the fuse. And in the end, that bad decision would be for Daniel Bryan to not even enter the match at all, something which WWE had done in the hopes it would leave fans more accepting of Batista coming out the winner. But as we all know now, they were not accepting. No, instead, they would spend the last 10 minutes of the bout raining down boos on it, with those boos only getting worse when Big Dave eventually eliminated Roman Reigns to come out the winner. And the anger would only get worse from there, with the company eventually being forced to retcon the whole incident and have the American Dragon be inserted into the WrestleMania main event a few months later, where he'd go on to win the title. That said, at least Vince McMahon learned from his mistake and made sure he never did the same thing again, right? Well, no, actually, because just 1 year later, the exact same thing would happen when Roman Reigns won the Royal Rumble in 2015. That's right, those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it, and the boss certainly ignored history when it came to the fan outcry for the year before, because by the time 2015 rolled around, despite Daniel Bryan still being far and away the biggest babyface on the roster, he'd moved on to his new favorite toy, Roman Reigns. And sure, Reigns had a lot of potential even back then, potential which would eventually see him blossom fully into the tribal chief. But at this point, he was far from ready for the main event, with fans sensing that they were going to get another top star pushed down their throats like they had with John Cena before. They would start to rebel against this in the lead up to the event. Of course, at the time, no one really thought Bryan had any chance of winning the Rumble this year because he'd been out for months with an injury. But when it was announced in the weeks leading up to the event that he was finally ready to return to competition and that he was entering himself into the 30-man Battle Royal, everyone assumed McMahon had decided to listen to the fans and go with him instead of Roman. Except he wouldn't. And when Bryan came out to the ring midway through the bout and was eliminated soon thereafter, the audience in attendance started to see what was going on. And that was why the rest of the Rumble would be met with an even worse reaction than the year prior, with the bulk of this hatred being directed towards Reigns himself. Hell, even an appearance from Roman's cousin The Rock at the end of the match couldn't get fans on his side. So with him now having botched the most easy-to-get-over match of the year twice in a row, many fans began to wonder if Vince really hadn't lost his touch completely. That said, if they went back a couple of years, they'd have evidence to suggest this had already happened then, because it was in 2012 that the boss failed in his attempts to book a truly once-in-a-lifetime angle, and that was the return of Brock Lesnar. Yes, after leaving WWE in the early 2000s and going on to join the world of MMA, the Beast would prove he was one of the toughest men on the planet when, in only his fourth professional fight, he beat Randy Couture to become the UFC heavyweight champion. After that, with him now becoming a box office sensation for Dana White, WWE would always be on the lookout for an opportunity to bring him back into the fold. And while at least initially, Brock would appear to have no interest in returning to wrestling, by 2012, following a bout of diverticulitis which temporarily ended his career in the Octagon, he'd finally decide to go back to the place that first made him famous. Of course, at this point, Vince McMahon was handed the story of a lifetime, a former superstar returning to the company after conquering the world of MMA, someone who now had more legitimacy than perhaps any wrestler ever since Harley Race. All he had to do then was tell the story of Brock going through everybody, all in preparation for the day when, eventually, somebody would beat him. Instead of doing this, though, Vince would decide he had to put Lesnar in his place for having left him all those years ago, and he would do this by having him lose his first match back to John Cena. Yes, you heard that right, even with this being right during the period when Big Match John was supposed to be having his worst year ever, McMahon still couldn't bring himself to have his top star lose to someone who, if we're being honest, could have easily beaten anyone on the roster in a shoot fight. So choosing to flush money down the drain then, he would book Cena to come out victorious once the time for their match came at April 29th's Extreme Rules. And like that, the once-in-a-lifetime story was over, and fans were left angry and confused by how the whole affair had gone. Of course, as the years have gone on, the state of confusion and anger has been a common thing for WWE fans to find themselves feeling, as during the latter days of Vince McMahon's run, it would seem like almost every booking decision he made was a poor one. Still though, for as bad as some of them may have been, there was only one which managed to kill off not only a top babyface, but also an ever-popular match type and the most intriguing heel in the company at the time too, and that was when The Fiend fought Seth Rollins at Hell in a Cell 2019. Now, we're sure you all remember this catastrophe, but for those of you who might not, back in the summer of 2019, Bray Wyatt had just managed to rescue his career by changing his gimmick up from being that of a Bayou cult leader to more of a Mr. Rogers-style kids show host. But this wasn't all the new character had going on, because bubbling under the surface of his nice new demeanor sat his most demonic creation yet, The Fiend. And once The Fiend finally escaped and made it to TV, it instantly became all fans could talk about, because with him looking like a full-blown horror movie monster and having one of the best entrances in the business, it was by far and away the best thing going in WWE. Of course, with a character like this, however, a delicate touch would have to be taken when it came to booking, because with it being so supernatural in nature, it was very easy for it to clash awkwardly when placed up against other pockets of the roster. As far as Vince McMahon was concerned though, all he saw was money in the gimmick, and so, instead of building The Fiend up carefully over the next year or so, he'd push him into the main event scene when he was booked to face then Universal Champion Seth Rollins at that October's Hell in a Cell pay-per-view. That said, McMahon didn't actually want Seth to lose here either, as he had been riding a wave of fan momentum ever since beating Brock Lesnar for the WWE title at that August SummerSlam. So realizing he'd booked himself into a corner then, the boss would begin thinking of ways to get out of this situation. And in the end, what he came up with was perhaps the worst possible idea, as in the middle of a Hell in a Cell match later that night, Seth Rollins would be disqualified when he got too scared of The Fiend and so threatened to beat him with a sledgehammer. Yes, in one fell swoop, The Fiend was made to look weak. Seth came across as little more than a scared wimp, and the idea of Hell in a Cell being a brutal, no-holds-barred encounter was killed off. It's actually quite impressive when you think about it. Though at the time, fans certainly didn't see any positives because, as the cell was being raised, they rained down chants of AEW to show their disapproval. But even if this one was bad, it still wouldn't be the end of The Fiend's woes, because after managing to somewhat recover when he became the Universal Champion a couple of months after this, his run would be butchered all over again when he lost to Goldberg in Saudi Arabia. That's right. When in February of 2020, the company decided that instead of having the top heel on their roster go into WrestleMania as their champ to face Roman Reigns, what they really needed was 53-year-old upstart Bill Goldberg. So, in front of an overheated and tired crowd of fans at that month's Super Showdown event then, the booking team would take a hammer to the kneecaps of Bray Wyatt when, in under 3 minutes, the unkillable monster was squashed by a man old enough to be his father. Of course, the backlash to this one would be swift and hard, with this marking the point where many fans finally turned on Goldberg. And as for Bray, well, it really is no surprise he apparently had a number of issues with management at this point, as all he was giving them was gold, and all they were handing back to him in return was manure. Still though, while he certainly has a valid reason to complain about the way he was booked during this period, even his woes can't compare to that of Bret Hart in the early 90s, because after having been coronated as the new face of the company when he won the WWF title in the autumn of 1992, he'd suddenly find himself being replaced once Hulk Hogan came back looking for his old spot again. Yes, while most fans were ready to see a new generation of stars such as the Hitman and Shawn Michaels take the ball and run with it at this point, Vince McMahon was still stuck in the rock and wrestling era. And that was why, despite him already having established Bret as his new guy, when he got the opportunity to bring Hulkamania back in early 1993, he just couldn't help himself from falling back into old familiar patterns. Of course, even if he was insistent on doing this, he could have gone a better way about it than to have Hart lose his WWF title to Yokozuna in under 9 minutes at WrestleMania 9, only for Hogan to then come out and squash the new champ in 22 seconds. And that's because, in doing it this way, all it achieved was to make Bret look like an afterthought and Yokozuna look like a loser. In fact, the only person who came out of this situation looking good at all was the Hulkster. Still, at least there was supposed to be some logic behind this one, because at the time the plan was reportedly for Hogan to pass the torch to Bret later that year at SummerSlam by dropping the belt to him. Unfortunately though, somewhere along the way, the Hulkster decided that didn't work for him, brother, and so instead, Bret would never get to challenge the man who'd upstaged him that March. No, he'd have to wait until WrestleMania 10 before he could get his belt back, in fact, with him at this time getting the win over Yoko himself, something which didn't quite have the same effect. But that wouldn't be the last time the Hitman had to deal with a poor booking decision as it happened, because while most of his WWF run after this would be more successful, by the time he jumped ship to World Championship Wrestling in 1997, it quickly became apparent that they had no idea what to do with him. And this is doubly disappointing because, following the events of the Montreal Screwjob, which saw him make his exit from New York, Hart was arguably the hottest babyface in the entire industry. All WCW had to do then was book him like the conquering star he was then, and they could reap all the financial rewards that came with this decision. Sadly though, with there being so much backstage politicking going on behind the scenes there, things never really got the chance to get out of first gear. Yes, with the likes of Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash looking to protect their spots, Bret had no opportunity to rise any higher than the upper mid-card for most of his run, with all his momentum fizzling away into nothing soon after that. That said, it wasn't all WCW's fault here, because after being screwed in his home country, it was clear that a lot of the desire to perform had been stolen away from the Hitman. And so, even if he was booked well, there's a good chance it wouldn't have lived up to expectations anyway. And it's not like the company didn't try to run with him later on once they realized their mistake, as by late 1999, he'd be the WCW World Champion. Unfortunately though, any momentum he was able to rebuild at this point would be squandered again when, a few months after, a series of concussions picked up over a short period of time would force Hart to retire from the ring, with him never getting to return for a proper match again after this. Yes, it was a sad end to the career of one of the greatest to ever do it. And even if he did come back for a pretty bad exhibition bout with Vince McMahon years later, fans understood this to be nothing more than an appendix to his otherwise stellar body of work. It's just a shame that the same can't be said for our next subject then, because after having spent almost 2 decades being the lone holdout from WCW when it came to jumping to WWE, Sting would finally make his WrestleMania debut in 2015, only to lose to Triple H. But how could this one have possibly come about? After all, when he first appeared at the prior November Survivor Series, Steve Borden had been treated like the all-conquering hero he'd been back in the old days. More than that, in fact, because during his first few months on the roster, he would serve the same purpose as his Crow incarnation had done during its early days, with him watching all the goings-on in the company from a distance here and choosing a side who he thought was the most righteous. And this side would obviously be that of the good guys, as come April of 2015, it became all too clear that the Stinger's ultimate target was Triple H, the top on-screen heel authority figure by this point in time. So soon after that then, the challenge would be made and the match would be booked for WrestleMania 31, with this marking the first time Sting had ever competed inside of a WWE ring. And while what followed should have been the easiest storyline in the world, the legendary moral crusader overcomes the evil authority. In the weeks leading up to the match, Vince McMahon decided to turn the whole thing into another tired old WWE versus WCW storyline. Of course, given how unwilling the boss had been to let his competition get any sense of forward momentum during the invasion angle, he was never going to let one of his guys lose to an outsider here. And so that was why, to the bafflement of every fan in attendance, after a fun bout which saw run-ins from both the NWO and D-Generation X, Triple H would lay out his opponent with a sledgehammer and pin him 1, 2, 3. After that, the aura of Sting never felt as strong in WWE again. In fact, it wouldn't be until he signed with AEW in 2019 that he would start to regain some of that feeling once more. Unfortunately for our next entry, though, they would never get a run with Tony Khan's company to help them recover from a truly awful booking decision. What was this decision? Well, it was the time Kevin Nash texted himself, of course. Yes, in 2011, right in the middle of the hottest angle WWE had run in years, the Summer of Punk 2.0, Big Sexy himself would get involved, much to the chagrin of fans. And the reason why they were so upset about this was because the whole thing had started out as Punk waging war against the system, all with the intent of bringing about change and launching the industry into a new boom period in the process. By the time things got to that year's SummerSlam, however, it was clear that things were going off the rails when, during the WWE title match, Nash would return to the company to interfere and cost the voice of the voiceless the belt. But who had sent the mysterious text message asking him to show up that night? Well, despite the consensus among fans at the time being that Triple H put him up to it, in the end, it was revealed that Nash had texted himself. A plot point we still can't figure out, no matter how hard we try. Yes, apparently taking it upon himself to interfere for no reason, Nash took so much of the focus away from Punk here that, pretty soon after this, the story became more about him versus Triple H than anything else. But while this booking decision heavily contributed towards killing the best angle of the 2010s, even it isn't the worst of all time. And that's because if we go all the way back to the early 80s, we'll find a bad booking decision which forever changed the industry, and that was Verne Gagne's refusal to put the AWA World title on Hulk Hogan. Yes, before Hulkamania was running wild in WWF, it actually began up in Minnesota with the American Wrestling Association in 1981. Of course, at this time, this was a promotion built more heavily on realistic sports-style encounters, with most of the top guys there being people who looked like they could believably win a bar brawl or amateur wrestling competition. And that's what led to the likes of Nick Bockwinkel, Fritz von Erich, Gene Kiniski, and Gagne himself holding the belt over the years, as in Verne's mind, each of these brought legitimacy to the whole company. That said, by the time the 80s rolled around and Hogan was taking off, it became clear that fans were thirsty for something new, as while he may have been more of a cartoon character than a legitimate-looking athlete, he got more over than anyone else on the roster in a very short space of time. So at this point then, it felt like the AWA was at a crossroads. Did it go with Hogan and all the new things he represented? Or did it stick with the traditions of the past and hope that this would continue to work out for them? Well, as we all know now, the promotion chose the latter option. And this, combined with the fact that his employer wanted the money from all his t-shirt sales going forward, it would ultimately lead to the Hulkster deciding he didn't have a long-term future with Verne Gagne. And when Vince McMahon came along in 1983 and pitched Hogan on the idea of taking WWF nationwide with his vision of sports entertainment then, the superstar in waiting would jump ship, with the rest from there being history.